as a motivating backdrop for this work, I think Biden released this executive order that was got a lot of attention in the AI world. I think interesting in the sense that it lays out the first framework or like policy action from the US government on should we approach AI. One section in particular was interesting to us, where basically they talk about dual use foundation models. This is probably sort of familiar to you if you've seen like the work out of Stanford, which is just generally discussing what a foundation model is. It's sort of something that is a big model that has like a lot of data, pre-training, and as a result has a lot of knowledge, and then we're going to build on top of it. And then so the dual use part is sort of referring to this nature where both that they can help people with science, but also be used for harm. And specifically here, they point out, if you look at like point I, CBRN, which are chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons. This is like a DoD designation, I think. We basically wanted to operationalize this risk. Like they're just generally talking that these could be a threat, and we wanted to understand how specifically language models might actually aid people in like lowering the barrier for entry to design these like CBRN weapons. And so that sort of inspired the WMDP data set. Basically, this data set, we like just focus on chemistry, cyber, and bio, so some subset of this, but we wanted to measure how much hazardous knowledge like these language models have for these specific categories. And so essentially, this is going to serve as both like a data set to measure models' proxy knowledge, but also a benchmark that like researchers can develop unlearning methods to like actually reduce the hazardousness of the models on. So this is like the overall summary. I think you can see sort of here, there's a few like sub areas. We worked with a lot of like different groups to create these. And so these like classifications or taxonomizations come from the experts. We didn't really do any of the data set collection. We were essentially just the facilitators for that. Most of our work is going to be near the like later half, which is the technical side. When I say we didn't do a lot of work, I think we didn't do any of the actual question writing, but we did most of the organizational work, and my co-author Nat did that, so I don't want to give him less credit for that. But this was a big, I guess, kind of pull from like a bunch of companies. Let's suppose that we're going to go in and like try to measure like hazardous knowledge in a model. Naively, you could just like come up with a bunch of questions that you know are bad, right? Like, for example, if you want to develop like smallpox, there are certain like instructions you need to follow, or even specifically like what is the actual RNA structure of the virus. So if you have that, then you can just go in with like your synthesizing tools. If you know how to operate those, you can create smallpox. And so if the model also knows this, then that would not be good. But again, if we actually like create a data set of these like specifically actually dangerous pieces of information, then if we release this to the public, this is actually quite bad, because then they could just use it for their own purposes or even train models on it, right? Another example of this is like in cybersecurity, there's what is known as zero-day exploits, which is basically like bugs in the code, in the like OS or whatever, that are very critical and have not been developed or identified by developers. If you release a data set of these 0 days, this is directly harmful because you can just take these and exploit them. And so hackers typically first report this to the company before they patch them up. But anyways, you can sort of see the challenge here, right? It's not so easy to just go out and create like the exact hazardous knowledge. We sort of want to target specifically things that are similar or around these like dangerous pieces of information, but we don't want to actually get the red stuff. And so here we focus more on this like yellow stuff, which is things, I guess you could say, that are in biosecurity and cybersecurity that are relatively dangerous, but perhaps not actually bad if released. I think a lot of the criticism of like this work, but also broadly in this like area, comes from like how do we like actually carve out this space. And I think it's important to, at least my takeaway, one of my takeaways from doing this project is that it's actually quite difficult, or there's not a lot of consensus between experts even on like what the yellow parts should be. I think there should be more work in actually identifying that. And so hopefully this sort of serves as like inspiration for that. And then the green area is just like general like knowledge in this thing, right? Like so for bio, it's like cells are made out of mitochondria, et cetera. And essentially we want to like have that to sort of make sure that our unlearning is precise, right? The safest model is a model that does not exist. You could just delete all the knowledge, you could fry all the weights, but that's not really a useful model. And so we need like this green to sort of act as a regularization or check to make sure that we didn't actually delete all of bios or cyber. So this data set is just going to focus on the yellow part. And I guess to be a little bit more specific, how do we actually get this yellow part? These are sort of just conceptual ideas, but in a lot of biology, for example, you're going to have like this kind of tech tree or idea, I guess, structural ideas that build on top of each other. So if you understand general microbiology, you might not know about like specific like facts about bacteria or viruses. And then even after that, there's like more specific things that are related to like anthrax or like influenza. Essentially, like we try to collect things that are, so we don't actually do this, but we try to ask experts to sort of like find things that are around this yellow thing that are like sufficiently deep in the tree such that if you were to remove them, models would probably not know anything of like the actual dangerous red stuff. So if you remove like models' knowledge of like enhanced PPPs, then probably it doesn't know how to like ideate novel like pandemic pathogens. But then another important thing here is that we can just focus on targeting this yellow stuff and this is relatively safe. And we're also not removing the general like green knowledge. Another example is like things in chemistry. There's like generally a bunch of several different topics. There are specific molecules that are like harmful, but there's also specific molecules that have similar properties that aren't necessarily as dangerous. You could probably think of like, I think like cowpox versus smallpox is a case for bio, but like for chemistry, there's probably other similar things. And so if you can kind of get like knowledge that is like relatively close to the actual like hazard, but not like actually dangerous, then this is also helpful. And then this last part, components, this is related to cybersecurity. In cybersecurity specifically, there's like different parts or pieces of the pipeline that you need to get right in order to actually launch and execute an attack. Our partner experts sort of came up with this framework, or this is sort of like a common thing in the cybersecurity landscape, and they sort of thought through, so among this framework, like what parts that difficult for a human that a language model might actually give leverage for, and can we like sort of design questions to test that? So for example, reverse engineering like system code is like one of these things that we have in our data set. Basically, we had this sort of overview. We asked our partners to come up with the taxonomy, and then we sort of gave them these instructions to like focus on this. And then they ended up coming with this data set. And so what we end up with is we get like these 4-choice, multiple choice questions. I think if you've heard of, I guess, Anthropic or OpenAI's data set, you probably have seen that they're actually more like sort of with humans in the loop. We had a discussion about whether or not to do that, but we focused on doing like this automatically evaluatable data set because we think it's sort of important that like anyone can sort of just test these models. Oftentimes these evaluations from like OpenAI and Anthropic are useful, but not actually like useful for the general public because they're private and cannot be executed by most people.
When you said automatically evaluatable data set, can you please elaborate on this?
So what I mean is that you can just run this you can evaluate WMDP by running prompts and getting responses out of models. So basically running inference on the model, and you don't need a human in the loop. You can just run these like 4,000 multiple choice questions in, and then you'll get like your answers, and then you just check how high its accuracy is.
In the end, human is checking the accuracy.
Well, you could also have a machine report that, but basically you get a number without any humans in the loop. Whereas some data sets, for example, like you could imagine OpenAI has a similar version of this, but it's more human in the loop. So what they need to do is they need to have actual like novices and experts sit down and try to like talk to the language model and see if that they can build like a better cyber weapon or bioweapon. And then again, the scoring is also done by human experts who like sort of judge whether or not the users were successful. So you can see that this process might be a little bit more thorough, but this takes a lot more time and resources. And so in contrast, this is just a much faster like evaluation. And that's what I mean by like automatically evaluatable.
How we ensure the quality of the data set if expert is not evaluating the accuracy?
I guess the quality of the data set comes in from like the fact that the questions are written by the experts and checked by experts. So as long as the questions are reasonable, then if a model scores highly on this WMDP data set, it probably has more knowledge of hazardous or generally hazardous knowledge as opposed to something that scores less. And that's like where the quality comes in.
Understood. So experts were in the beginning of the process,
Yeah.
not the middle and in the end. Understood.
Yeah. So basically to reiterate, we didn't write this data set. This is like written by like actual like people with PhDs in like biology and chemistry, and then also like people who work as like actual cybersecurity consultants in industry. So these guys will like you as a company, like if you have code you want to test, you ask people to like come in and sort of stress test or red team your system. And basically we ask these experts to also write this data set. I'll go sort of get into the threat models a little bit more briefly because we don't have too much time. But basically, like these are what the experts came up with in each field for how like the threat model. So in biology, there's like this DBTL loop, which is called design, build, test, learn. And essentially, like you come up with a model, you like synthesize it. Sorry, you come up with a protein, you synthesize it, you test it to see if it's like has high efficacy, and then you like update your design and like come up with new proteins. And then basically they were, I guess our experts were sort of concerned with models' ability to help people design new proteins and also learn from their like experiments. And so a language model, for example, if you like ask it a query, might actually come up with this like synthesis of like different papers it's seen, and maybe will suggest new ideas or ideas like faster than you could have suggested. And this will be like very efficient for people who want to develop a bioweapon. So this is like sort of how the threat model like fits in. And so I guess if our experts are concerned about this, then they're going to write specific questions that see like, okay, how good are models at like figuring out what is the relevant protein here? How good are they at using like tools or generalizing from experiments, etc. Basically just testing this like aspect of design. For the cybersecurity threat model, for example, this is like again from another expert. This is like basically the four stages of a cyber attack. Specifically, like the more one that's like sort of difficult for humans or difficult to automate is like weaponization, which is like taking a system, identifying like the various vulnerabilities, and then constructing a weapon. So hackers are very good at this, especially skilled ones. And I think they're all, for now at least, they're far better than language models. But if you have a novice, they're sort of not necessarily like too familiar with like different vulnerabilities for different operating systems and software and such. Language models have sort of seen a lot of this, so it can at scale suggest a bunch of different things to try, and it might actually just deploy these automatically. And so this is sort of one thing you could be worried about, where how good is a language model at sort of identifying like bugs in code, and can we like deploy that at scale? And so this is like one thing, for example, that's actually tested by our data set. So now I'm going to sort of shift directions a little bit. We've talked about like the overall data set, and we can talk about that later in the questions, but I want to kind of emphasize the technical work we did. So on top of building the data set, we also wanted to actually like reduce models' performance on this benchmark, right? It's one thing to actually measure the hazard, but it's another thing to try to like take some steps to reduce it. And so this is what we focused on, which is this method called RMU. Essentially, this is an unlearning method. So what it does is like on specific WMDP questions, or generally like this hazardous distribution, it tries to mess up or like remove or unlearn model knowledge and preserve general knowledge. Like it should not have knowledge of like these like reverse engineering like specific binary code, but it should generally know like computer science principles, for example. So on this slide is this picture of our method. It operates basically in two parts. So the first part on the left is the forget term. So the critical piece for this is that you have this distribution of like knowledge that you don't want. So it's called deforget. So when you sample items from that, you can like pass those through your model and then kind of compute the representation at like a specific layer. Basically, you want to blow that representation up. So this C times the unit vector is essentially like some scaling term where we look at the norm of this orange activation and then we try to scale it up or down or whatever. And basically we mess up the activations on the deforget set. And then we have the deretain set, which is you could imagine knowledge that we'd want to keep. For example, like general biology knowledge. And so here we have two copies of the model. We have the unlearned model in orange and the frozen model as a regularizer in blue. And we pass the samples from the D retain set through both the models, and we just like have a L2 regularization term, basically just this MSE loss to ground the orange and the blue like representations close to each other. And then we find that this empirically works decently at fixing WMDP or like helping with WMDP. And what do I mean by that? Essentially, like we're going to need to actually collect these deforget and deretain, and that's what we're discussing here. But actually, what are, I guess, the results with this model? So we kind of see that we're able to, from the base model, which is in this dark blue, reduce performance on these two parts of bio. We only tested on bio and cyber because at the time we didn't have a really good forget set for chemistry. We're able to drastically drop performance close to random chance. There's still a little bit of knowledge in the model, but it's not fully there. And we're able to maintain most of the performance on MMLU, which is this, if you're not familiar with this general like benchmarking suite that's used to like track what is model's general knowledge. So WMDP you can think of as like WMDP bio and cyber as a more specific and hazardous version of MMLU. So we're sort of getting the yellow stuff, and we're preserving a lot of the green stuff from earlier. And then, of course, again, we measure this by just like passing in data points to the model and checking the actual like eval accuracy. Another thing that I think is pretty interesting is that on WMDP bio, we are actually able to like generalize this like hazardous knowledge performance to like this other private set of questions. And so I guess zooming out, what are we trying to look at here? One thing that we hope for with unlearning in general and WMDP is to measure like, does this actually capture hazardous knowledge, right? For example, if we unlearn on WMDP bio and we say that, okay, it doesn't know general like pandemic pathogens, will this actually generalize to like a new pandemic pathogen that comes out? And so the way we tested this is like we collected WMDP bio at first, and then we had our partners sort of go in and look at the data set again. And then they basically flagged a few like 100 questions that they thought were actually still too harmful to release to the private public. And so we have this private set of hazardous questions. So essentially we only like kind of evaluate on WMDP bio, and we sort of kind of develop our forget corpuses for unlearning on WMDP bio, and we sort of see if this generalizes to this private set of questions that we have. And so we sort of see that here that this is like at least a small experiment that shows progress in this direction. You could also ask like, is the knowledge stored maybe not in like the last layer? Maybe all you're doing is sort of like contorting the like final layer outputs. And if you were to probe like earlier parts of the model, then you would be able to like recover the knowledge. We see here again that like basically the dashed line is the original performance for bio and cyber, the green and the blue. And then the solid line is the unlearned performance. So you can see that after unlearning, most of the knowledge, like after like layer 10, which is where we perform unlearning at for Zephyr, and like layer, I think 30-ish is where we're performing it for Yi, gets deleted. And so again, this is a little bit more evidence that we're actually like removing knowledge in unlearning. And then finally, like this last bit is if you were to try to like do this like adversarial suffix that has been released, this GCG attack, are you able to extract knowledge from the model? And we can see that basically by default, like if you have no suffix, then RLHF sort of basically tells the model, oh, you can't answer with like these specific dangerous things, like how do I construct a cyber weapon? Whereas if you add this like model specific suffix, then it's able to answer. Sorry, here the example is like influenza A. For our model, the unlearn one on the bottom, in both cases, it sort of like outputs garbage whenever it sees like things that it's been exposed to that are irrelevant, or sorry, that it should forget. So you can't really like extract any useful information from that. Sort of the last thing I want to end on is that this is not like the actual end all be all of unlearning. We don't do super well in like specific areas. Basically, there needs to be more work on developing like methods that are more precise at unlearning. So for example, we do pretty good at maintaining like most of MMLU and most of college CS, but like specific things like computer security and college biology, there's still a little bit of a drop from our unlearning, which suggests that the model has been like unlearned too much a bit. Although I think this is like a lot more progress than past works, and especially the baselines we compare to, we still can have room for like improving on these unlearning models and making them more precise. And then basically we hope that WMDP offers like one route to like testing this and evaluating this at scale. So I'll sort of just leave this up on the board. I can talk through these points if we want to, but yeah, I think that's a pretty good place to stop. This is sort of, in my view, one like pretty big step forward in terms of data sets and policy for understanding language model and hazards, and then actually trying to like remove and unlearn those like hazards so that this use or threat of malicious use goes down over time.
I was just hoping that you might show us some examples of questions. I mean, I just mentioned in there that what you're trying to do here just, I don't know, it just seems like such an impossible task, be able to identify specific questions or areas in there that are, where you can limit productivity, but at the same time, not completely destroy useful knowledge.
I personally didn't do too much with data set collection, so I'm not going to go through and specifically look at questions, but feel free on your own time to like look. I think this is a really good question, and we did get a lot of like sort of pushback on this. I actually want to like point out something interesting where your view, I guess, is actually more similar to what the cybersecurity people thought than the biosecurity people thought. And I think the fact that there's like sort of like a difference in like philosophies or maybe even political orientations, I'd say, between these two groups is sort of what gives rise to this. All the cybersecurity people were sort of, when we asked them to do this, we're like, oh, I don't think this is a good idea. In general, we want these models for like developing like red teaming and actually helping us and white hat hackers like develop bugs. And if you were to like remove this from models, then this would not be good and we wouldn't be able to do our work as efficiently. And plus, anyways, you aren't going to stop hackers. On the other hand, the bio people were actually a lot more sympathetic to this. I think probably just because of their culture. Their people, I think, had disagreements on like what specific questions we had should put in our data set. But I think everyone sort of agreed that, yeah, like it's not good to have the smallpox like RNA strand just like leaking on the internet. And so I think it's interesting. I think two things from this work. First, there should be more discussion, at least between experts on what the consensus is for like how we're actually going to deploy these models and like what is I guess like a precise taxonomization of what's like dangerous or not. I think we took a stab at that, and you could argue that there might be like better like carvings up of the actual space, but I think that's something for experts and hopefully like more governments to decide in like discussion with each other. But there needs to be that discussion because I think models are getting quite capable and it's important to like understand that. Second, I think like even if you do take more of the cybersecurity view and think that, oh, it's probably dangerous to like, or it's not great to like remove all this because we're going to lose a lot of productivity gains, there is this like kind of format called structured access, right? Like I think in chemistry, for example, all like grad students and researchers have access to this database of like chemical reactions. But normal people just do not have access to this because it's sort of not useful and not helpful probably for people to have access to this knowledge. And so you might imagine that in the future, how things get deployed is that you have like this open source, generally like model that's been like unlearned and safe. And you might have more closed source versions of the model that are like restricted behind API access that are only like given to like certain users, basically like a know your customer model. We don't allow like just anyone to like access the base model. And so that could be a like way forward with this paradigm.
You did the unlearning to avoid these harmful data that is learned by the model. Did you also measure the impact of this on the general biology knowledge? Like, how much degradation you had on the general knowledge of biology?
We did do that here. Here, college biology is probably the closest thing to the thing that we were testing in MMLU. I think it's a little bit expensive to get like even like more specific things. We just didn't have that data set, but you can see that with RMU, this unlearning, there is still a drop in general like biology knowledge. And so or college biology knowledge, and especially in virology, which we think is not too dangerous. So basically you can see that we're able to do unlearning and like not delete most of the things, but there's still like a little bit of gaps in like some specific areas that are more related to these hazards.
These neurons are not specific to the biology, right? It may have an impact on other aspects of learning too. How do you know? How do you know how much degradation do you have on, say, other general knowledge that you
If you want, you can go through the paper and then we have like more of a complete breakdown of the categories, but you could critique that this is like a issue with industry and general evaluation, but people typically just use MMLU as this broad knowledge because it has a bunch of like scientific categories. It has like physics, math, computer science, humanities, like law, philosophy, etc. So it's this huge data set of like various like questions that you might like expect a college grad in this area to know. And so that's like this all performance category on the left. And so on average, we're not deleting most of the things. And then I'm just basically showing that there's specific areas that drop a little bit more, but most of the time, like the performance, I think, drops by 1 or 2%. So it's not too different from like a base model.
So basically, it's not that model became completely dumb.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, like if you want to make things safe, you just don't release the model. That's like something that people are discussing. Or you could do the naive thing of like completely capping like bio and CS knowledge. But then again, sort of back to Lonnie's point, it's not really helpful for these like learning tasks or like education. And people actually do need models for these things. And so there needs to be like a trade-off that we're navigating.
Today, these language models, are kind of associative. They kind of spit things out very quickly, and we don't see a lot of success in very long multi-step inference. But I mean, we're all kind of imagining that in the next year or two, they're going to be able to string together longer inference chains, and most of this knowledge that's dangerous arrived in this world through inference chains, right? Where people strung lots of basic things together to arrive at those conclusions. So, so does it seem to you that like at that stage, it might, the basic knowledge might end up kind of being as bad as the final knowledge? And does that kind of make the unlearning maybe not as plausible? What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. We also thought about this too in our discussions. I think it remains to be seen how much reasoning can actually get you, but I do think that that's a very valid concern that, like you unlearn most of the bad stuff, but then again, like you feed in like just general knowledge to the model, but you could even put it in the context window and then just have it reason and then like give you like some interesting novel like design fact for a bioweapon. I think this is a very like plausible way that like I don't know how much actors might actually do this, but is a plausible thing that might happen. I do think that this means unlearning might not be the most effective thing. I think generally how I think of defenses is not like this thing needs to solve the entire problem, but like more of how we think of I guess general info security, right? Or like biosecurity. You have like different like areas or like mechanisms for defense, right? So unlearning could be one thing to make the models generally harder to like perform this reasoning. Another thing that you would want, which people are already doing, is like input filtering, so that like when you actually like put in bad text, like another model checks and says like, should I even like try to answer this query? Another thing is output filtering. It's like, is this like piece of text that I produced like actually dangerous? If you know like the Sora model from OpenAI, the video model, they actually do this where if you so in that case, they're concerned more about like copyright and like nudity and stuff like that. But if you input like a thing that might be dangerous, it's flagged. And they also like have a video model at the end of the output to like reject things that like also seem bad. And so I think unlearning might actually be like relatively ineffective if we have models that are able to reason, but it's still like if it's done properly and doesn't delete too much knowledge, can be like one part of this defense chain. And I think that's sort of how it should fit in. And in general, I think having companies think about models as like actually maybe more like nuclear fuel and sort of like actually like a dangerous component is a useful like paradigm. And I think unlearning sort of like adds to that. So that's where I see it fitting in. I don't think it's going to be like a complete solution. Yeah.
Yeah, you kind of touched on one other thing there too. I was wondering about if you actually trained on the dangerous knowledge in order to develop the perfect sensor, and you kind of alluded to maybe maybe that is a possibility where the trick to prevent jailbreaks would be to make sure that the model generating information is kept separate from the model that acts as the sensor. So, the one who censors information. from the output.
So I actually think this is a pretty reasonable idea. You're basically just keeping like two, like abstractly, you have like two different data distributions and you're having them like check each other. I think with jailbreaks, it's probably a little bit more okay for companies to do this because, right, like what do we care about with jailbreaks? You might like be worried about stuff like copyright or sort of like bad, just like generally bad knowledge floating around. But for this specific like bio and cyber knowledge, if it's actually hazardous, there's probably needs to be more information security around that knowledge. And I think this is kind of where governments or like some other independent agency needs to step in. And something, I guess, with more experience like handling this sort of stuff. I guess I don't really believe that OpenAI and Anthropic are equipped to like have these own evaluations. And so I think one step, I sort of touched on this at the end, but like one hope that we might have with this like WMDP thing is to have like the government like develop their own like database of like hazardous knowledge, and then maybe they could sort of train a sensor model on this knowledge and then just like give this to companies rather than having this sort of like dangerous knowledge in the company's hands themselves.
Basically, you sort of trust government in this case more than private companies.
Well, okay, there's probably like two things here that's like affecting my answer. One, I'm just imagining that governments have more experience, like specifically dealing with like dangerous knowledge. I guess like the CIA is usually relatively good at classifying things. And I think, for example, like the CDC also has like its own like pathogen testing that it sort of like keeps secret. And these, I think like there is like something to be said about institutional like practices, and that is like a pretty big barrier actually of safety, like protecting people from like adversaries getting to this knowledge. And so I think companies, just because they're new and don't have as much experience with this, shouldn't have this. And then another thing here is also that there's a lot of competitive pressures, right? Like people want to release the model, people want to release the full model because we see that like unlearning does like actually reduce performance. And so I'm sort of worried that if you have like companies in-house like developing their own data sets and having their own in-house experts, like these experts can't really function appropriately. It's sort of just like, you know, cigarette companies or tobacco companies having their own in-house like medical experts. Like there's a huge conflict of interest for those experts. And so it's probably better if there's like a third party without like financial interest in the product actually being released to like do this sort of evaluation, storage, collection of like this hazardous information to like see, are these models bad? Can we make sure they're safe, etc.
I guess I would volunteer that having a government take over that role of providing the sensor model sounds to me like a really dangerous precedent. I mean, I understand you want to limit certain pieces of knowledge to trusted groups, you know, can keep it secret and not be dangerous. But once you kind of walk down that route of letting governments provide the censorship models, now you have, you know, the political party in power censoring criticism and, you know, stuff like that. You know, it just kind of seems like a real slippery slope.
I think this is sort of like where actually AI, because it's sort of becoming real world, becomes more of a political question. I do think there are like valid concerns with like giving too much like so I think you could sort of view this whole like discussion between unlearning as sort of maybe more of a libertarian take of, oh, let's just like have companies sort of regulate themselves. Obviously, they don't want to have bad stuff go around and bad press, and the market will correct for that, versus a more like, I guess, authoritarian take of like, well, we want, you know, to make sure that citizens are safe. We don't want these bad models running around. And I think here maybe WMDP is more positioned along this like kind of authoritarian work, like thinking. But I think in general, there should be a discussion as to like how we actually regulate these models. I don't think, at least personally after doing this project, that I think there actually is real risk, maybe less from the bio side, but from the cyber side, that people could just take these open source models that Meta's developing and then just like massively just try a bunch of vulnerabilities at scale. And so I think there does need to be like, maybe not like governments and there's a slippery slope, but there needs to be some sort of intervention. Whether or not that happens at like different like forms of government or like power is a separate question. But I don't think just purely allowing companies to regulate themselves is like the right approach for this.
There's a extremely powerful open source language model and let's say bad actors who have resources and who can basically build their own data set, basically fine-tune those models on specific like threats.
Yeah, I think this is a relatively possible scenario to happen. I actually think that, like one paradigm that might emerge in the future is that open source models are like somewhat capped, and maybe there's more like technical research to like make sure that open source models can't be easily fine-tuned on these data sets. I think we'll see, at least in the US, there's like sort of an interesting line of thought that I hadn't really confronted before. But even if we don't have like any sort of regulation, there's this whole legal system, especially like with not like criminal liability, but just tort liability of if, for example, this CrowdStrike incident were to occur because some company took Meta's like llama model and like just trained it on it. I think it sort of depends on the jurisdiction and like the like actual specifics of the case, but there's actually a lot of like financial like punishment that might occur to Meta for actually releasing this model, because you could argue that this is like a negligent act. So we might actually see like companies themselves like sort of pulling their punches with these models. I think it's interesting. We'll see like how open source development plays out, but I do think it is possible that this like ends up being like an actual threat in the future, especially for cyber attacks, because they're generally quite good at writing code, at least right now. And like you could imagine that like with GPT-5 or Llama 4 that this becomes like amplified.
Does it mean that you're in the camp of closed source models?
I actually hear maybe like personally I'm a little bit leaning more towards like this libertarian camp of like we should like have companies figure it out. I think maybe more of the incentive structure should come from like forcing companies to like internalize their costs. I think right now, for example, like CrowdStrike in some sense is like an externalized cost, right? Like so much disruption happened because of this incident, but they are forced to pay a fine, but it doesn't like really reflect the magnitude of that. And so if there is like a way, maybe through like the common law or like these like legal incentives or through government regulatory agencies to sort of have companies like actually make sure that their models are safe, we hopefully might see progress on this. I mean, if not, then maybe I'd be more in favor of closed source models. I think it's sort of just, it depends on how things play out. But I think at least right now, the current state of things is sort of more towards the dangerous end.
So do you think it's possible with these open source models to train them, basically like, let's say, apply this unlearn method so that people can, get benefits from open source models, but it would be like really difficult for bad actors to develop, bioweapons and so.
Yeah, I think so. Dan Hendricks, the director for Center for AI Safety, the last author on this paper, had another paper that he was on. I think like it was basically a bunch of collaboration with people at UC. I can try to find it. That was basically trying to tackle this exact same problem. I think technically this is like really hard, right? Because the whole point of ML, you're basically fighting like 30 years of research development is to like develop models that are like efficient at ingesting data. And so if now you want to come along with like a method that basically like stops it from fine tuning, that's sort of almost like something that is like difficult because the architecture and the learning rate and everything has been like fine tuned or optimized to like make models faster at that. And so that's a hard problem, I think, but it's not clear that this is like impossible. This is just sort of like generally, I think it's a probably hard problem, and most people in ML think it's a hard problem, but there might be work on that. Yeah. And I think that's an important line of research, especially because there is value in having open source development. I don't think that like having, like all the work be like centered at OpenAI or Anthropic is also a good like state of affairs too. So I think Meta has done a good job, but there is also a real risk. So it's sort of like, how do we navigate those trade-offs?